Thanks everyone for the last topic on regulatory. That was very, very interesting. And we actually touched upon something very important that I'm going to focus now on this session with you, and it's about the continuity of operations. And we all know that during COVID-19, the whole pandemic showed us how continuity of business and continuity of operations is super important. We knew that up front, but now this was like really key. I wonder, how did the decentralized clinical trial model empowered business continuity? But can you go into specifics? How did it actually happen?
Oh, where to start?
I'm like, Daniel,
Um,
you're up.
a lot of work. I mean, Jesus, there was so many hours, there were so many days in the beginning of this pandemic where I would blink and it was suddenly 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. My partner was like, "I get it. You're part of the healthcare ecosystem, and you've got to do what you got to do. But I'm also human, and I'm here. Hello." And so it was really difficult to to figure it out. In the earlier session, we talked about the box of crayons metaphor, and there I was finger painting at 11 o'clock at night with watercolors, trying to figure out how are we going to actually do this. And the reason why that's so important is because there's only so much creativity you can do before you still have a protocol you need to follow. There are things that you cannot change in the there's things, there are specific things that you cannot get creative with. You can get creative with the delivery of that, or in the way in which you obtain the data point individually. But you run into some brick walls, and the way that I thought about continuity of operations, my first question is, what are the brick walls? What are the absolute I cannot change X, Y, and Z factors and variables? And then let me build a map around that, in terms of how to navigate the pandemic. And then the third thing was, what financial impact is this going to have? If I'm changing the way in which the data is being delivered, if I'm changing the way in which this data is going to eventually get into that database, on the surface, is there any difference? Is an EKG value different because it was obtained in a decentralized modality versus an on-site clinic? Well, no. But does it impact the price? Does it impact the cost of obtaining that EKG? And then how do we justify that to sponsors? And also, what value and what motivator does a sponsor have to actually pay for that when there is no precedent? And this industry is very big about fair market value and looking at things on a global scale. But in fact, this pandemic came out of nowhere, and there was no precedent for having to pivot. There was no precedent from going smack in the middle of a trial and saying we need to renegotiate everything that's in the line items of this budget. So it's many levels, and I'm curious to see if Raymond or Edie want to touch on one of those angles where we can do a deep dive.
I'm reminded a bit about software. So I'm not a coder, but our company is about software. So the waterfall method is sort of the historical way of doing software, where you write a big long things with specifications, and then it's set in stone, and that guides everything for the next 12 months. And then there's agile, where you're doing short little tech sprints, and you're coding, and you keep your specifications relatively loose, and then you revise them. So the end product may be a little bit different than what you envision. It's going in the right direction, but you can adapt as you learn, and that's a much better way of doing things. It seems to me like most clinical trials are very much a waterfall, because if you just think about from a sponsor's perspective, I think there's a lot of documents that are put together that detail in extreme excruciating detail how every facet of the operation is to work. So if the monitoring plan says we shall do on-site monitoring every 8 weeks or whatever, that's what you do. And what happens when there's a pandemic and it's not practical to do that, right? I think people feel straitjacketed because they have to make all these commitments, and they live with that commitments for 24 to 36 months. So I don't know if there's any way to introduce some level of flexibility into this.
Yeah,
But
and I think it's important to recognize, like, when you think of the regulatory component of this, so at an IRB level, and then we'll talk about FDA as well, but at an IRB level, or an ethics review committee, as they're often referred to in Europe, at that level, it is not about, how do I say this? At that ethics review committee, that institutional review board, right? They definitely have certain standards, obviously regulations they have to adhere to, and how and what they can approve, and best practices. Having said that, if you want to do remote monitoring versus on-site monitoring, and you have a detailed, foolproof, compliance double-checked way with privacy and confidentiality built in for both, The IRB does not give two hoots which one you do, as long as you describe it and whatever is approved you stick to. And if you want to then pivot to the other, you write the IRB and you say, I have an amendment. We're now going to do it this way. And the IRB looks at it and goes, that sounds great. Now follow that, right? And so the stance very early on in COVID was, we are ready for your amendments. We expect to see your amendments, right? Because they understood, as did the FDA, because the FDA looks, the FDA and the IRB in America have that relationship. They're relying on one another to act as and have their regulatory checkpoints. And so the FDA knew that you would have to submit amendments with the IRB to make those changes, as well as if the change you made was so categorical, it impacted your investigational, essentially, license with the FDA to use your device or your test article for research, then you would also be updating and providing either an informational amendment or an actual amendment to that license with the FDA, and they would be reviewing it as well. And so it really wasn't about you have to do on site, you have to do remote. It was you just have to stick to whatever you said the plan was. If the plan needs to change, you can do that in a heartbeat.
Mm.
And so it was all about whether or not your sponsored research was actually then pivoting and making the change. Because anyone who works in regulatory will tell you, yeah, everything you just said is true, Edie. But have you ever tried getting a sponsor to amend a protocol just for your one little site and your one little needs? Like that ain't ever going to happen. And so I think it's a matter of, I hate to push it back on the sponsors. I'm not trying to dog on them, but it does start at that level unless it's truly an investigator initiated trial.
And I will further push, because the operations person at the table with this conversation is thinking, who's going to actually do all of this? Who is going to actually write all those amendments? Who is going to actually liaise with the sponsor? Who's going to liaise with the IRB? Have we even talked about the PI? Have we gotten the PI's perspective on his or hers or their ability to provide quality oversight? Are they comfortable with this plan? There's a lot of coordination, and I got to be the person that said I'm a study coordinator by trade. And I feel like study coordinators are oftentimes the unsung heroes behind the scene
Mm.
that are splitting their time from coordinating patients, being on the phone with patients, being the first point lifeline for patients, being the physician's left and right arm, and oftentimes left and right legs, because they can't seem to oftentimes move without their study coordinator. They're also the first people that get thrown into the direct line of fire with the IRB and expected to stay on top of IRB correspondence. And then you throw in a pandemic, and you throw in continuity of operations, and you throw in patients calling, asking questions. Is your site, is it safe for me to come in? I don't feel comfortable coming in. They have to liaise with the sponsor. And so there's a critical missing element there about who's going to champion the study coordinator. Who's going to go out there and say, study coordinator, focus on the most critical part of your job, which is the patient and ensuring the continuity of the trial. Who's going to then back them up, right? And to me, I just see dollar signs, because that means we need to hire staff. We need to
Yes.
hire a regulatory person, or we need to go externally and engage a regulatory person. And then sponsor needs to make that connection of like, hey, the site has your best interest, and so it's in your best interest to support them more. Don't tell the CRO, well, what do you think fair market value says? Well, what do you think? What all of that needs to go out the window, because unless you're explicitly going out and saying something outrageous like, I need $40,000 tomorrow because we just feel like having 40, obviously you need to put some guidelines around that, right? Be reasonable, but also be open and engaging to the conversation, because it's your trial.
Well, and I
this
think it's
might,
up to them, right? The protocol is yours. If it is a true, traditionally funded
yeah,
pharmaceutical sponsored trial, the protocol is owned by the sponsor. And in a post-COVID world, I would be curious to see in the United States alone, in our IRB setup, how we will get to sponsored trial protocols being written almost with a if-then logic stream, right? Like coding, in the
Yeah.
sense of, it would be, if I'm an IRB member and I'm evaluating your amazing trial that you're putting before me at, say, a major academic medical center, but it 100% in 2021 still relies on everybody coming in and everybody doing in-person visits only. My first thing I'm going to say is, hey, you know what, Raymond, great idea, great science, love where you're headed. What about the fact that this is not plausible in our current world, and we're not even out of our existing pandemic, and there may be, more struggles on down the line. You obviously haven't thought this out. And so I think it becomes some sponsors will get ahead of this, a few, and start writing protocols with that if then logic. If the following requirements are met, on-site monitoring may be required. However, if the following requirements or situational components are present, it may make more sense to do remote monitoring, and here's how that would be done. And then just get your protocol approved with the different if then statements. And it would just require the data, right? Like, you can't just say,
Yeah.
if the study coordinator feels like it on Wednesday,
Yeah, exactly.
right? It has to have that specific logic to it, but get it in there and then give your sites the discretion. That would be the best way to do it. And I think the good news is, this is where regulatory can be helpful, is that agencies like IRBs and ERCs, if they don't start seeing that language in the protocols, like, they might give it another 6-9 months, but by mid to late 2021, conducting a trial and you truly are basing it all on a completely centralized model with no alternatives, they're going to start going, no, that'll never work.
Right.
So
Go back
that
to the
brings me
table.
my next question, which is, are there any best practices? How should sponsors write their protocols, or not just protocols, but the SOPs for operations? I also connected to what you just said now. I believe, and also what Daniel said, and that's maybe if you can like a little bit tell me about what you think about that. We speak about the protocol only, but from what I hear, it's not only the protocol being adaptive, and we do know that actually there is such a form of adaptive protocol, but what about adaptive budget as well? So first, Edie, if you can comment on adaptive protocols and best practices in general, protocols and SOPs for operations, and then Daniel, if you can maybe tell me if it's possible to have an adaptive budget as well.
Yeah, so I would stick to what I basically already said in terms of an if-then logic format. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong, whether you're the site writing your SOPs, whether you're the sponsor writing, a more adaptive protocol, to lay out different avenues. And I think where this becomes critical is not only in the examples we just discussed, but as we then get into the trickier parts, right? Like consent. Are you going to have a trial where you could have in-person consent and could have a remote hybrid consent depending on patient needs? And there are ways to write that. The difference is, a year ago, I would have said, well, you need to probably have, I'm going to pick for the whole life of the trial and for every patient, this method or this method. Now, I would actually change what year ago Edie would say and say, no, you need to have the discretion as the site to truly make that decision per patient, because every patient is different. And you are going to have some who have factors as to, even if it's just their darn comfort level to coming on site versus wanting to take advantage of hybrid decentralized modalities. What's the point of having them if we're not? Sense, I would say, instead of trying to write it where your SO vague or more flexible, or gives you the option to pick one method or another throughout the whole trial, I would go even more into truly being able to pick on a situational basis, unless you just know,
like choosing the option. Like that's something I've been discussing with sponsors as well. If you have all these options available, that means that you have to have all the vendors available, all the options discussed with the site. It means money, and we all know that clinical research is already expensive. So I don't know, like, any thoughts on how this happened without spending like a huge amount?
I think it's absolutely a great approach. I mean, you could take that same approach about what type of consent you want and extend it down to, do you want this we're going to write a visit so that these procedures are done and these data points are captured. Now you have the option of being in clinic, you have the option of doing it at home, you have the option of retaining our third party if you can't send your staff, or you have the option of sending your staff there if you have the right SOP. So you can really just take any one of those operating procedures and just come up with a menu of 3 or 4 different options. I think that's wonderful. I think that's probably the right way to do it. I don't actually think it's going to be more expensive though. It's only expensive if your vendors don't give you unit-based pricing. If your vendors give you unit-based pricing, then you can pay for it, and you can probably predict the budget fairly reliably. And also some methods of operation are cheaper. I mean, why would monitoring be always on site or remote? Why can't you even let it flex? Why can't you let the sites choose how they want to be monitored? Sites can upload on this platform or upload on that platform. What difference does it make as long as the standard of having access to all the source data is available to the
Well, and that's
monitors?
what I would say is unit-based pricing, you as the site are going to have to obviously make some decisions from a budgeting perspective of what your costs are if you're going to also subscribe to that kind of a la carte menu, right? And give the sponsor and be able to have that conversation up front of if you select this with this with this, here's how much us as a site, it costs us to perform that with those particular modalities selected. Having said that, you may be trading one in out for the other, right? Like the idea of on-site monitoring has always been a bit ridiculous to me, especially in the late 2000s, just because the idea of the travel, the hotel, just all the expenses that come with that alone are huge when we have platforms that it's very rare that you truly need to be on site. There are reasons, but in most of your routine monitoring by a sponsor of a trial, there is no reason to be on site, just none. And frankly, the site would be thrilled to not have to spend a week preparing for you to take up 2 8-hour days as opposed to working over a platform. And so you could be saving there and you're just exchanging that, for example, for maybe a modality like electronic informed consent, where you might have to say, well, there is an extra cost for that. There's a platform we have to use, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's all more. I think some of it's less and some of it's more. And you have to really take that whole picture into account before the sponsors can really push back and say, well, we'd love to do all this, but it's all way more expensive. Some of it will be actually less. It'll be more cost effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge is people have to learn how to function across different modalities or systems or what have you. I think it's a learning process. It's probably the biggest challenge, right? Because you're now asking a little bit more from the monitors. They have to flex their working style to meet the requirements of the site.
Right.
Yeah, it was an incredibly there was it was an incredibly challenging experience to adapt to the pandemic. It was stressful. So let's just talk about the stress for a minute because we're not robots. And there were breakdowns, there were emotional reactions, there was uh, friction, there have been friction that has precipitated out of getting a monitor to adapt to your site specific SOP. And there is very colorful language that has come out of not wanting to use a certain thing. Why can't you just email me the document? I just want the link. I just want this folder. So you're right, Raymond. There's a learning component, but there was something, Maya, that you said about the adaptive budgeting component to it. And here's the thing: when us when we as a site decide, hey, this is we're bleeding some money or we're leaving some money on the table, it takes time to amend a budget. It takes time to amend a contract. You incur legal fees, so you need to spend money to get more money. And making that case to sponsors is a challenge when you're already when sites are already very much strained and stressed and already spread very thinly on just making sure they're staying afloat at the protocol level, just making sure that you're afloat at delivering the endpoints of your trial protocol, and then you say, hey, we need some cash. That alone is going to take time and effort to open up, to go through the lines, to gather the information, meet with the team and ask. Raymond, you said earlier, estimating the budget, right? Being able to better predict the true cost of business, and all that data gathering is more time that we're not getting compensated for. So in terms of adaptive budgeting, I've got at least 2 protocols that have come through our desk in the last month where the sponsor did exactly what Edie was talking about, which was the if and then language. And so if a visit is triggered X way, you're going to get reimbursed Y way, which I thought was really cool. The one thing that I would have wanted to see, that was awesome that they did that. The one thing I would have wanted to see, though, is opening it up and keeping it more tentative for conversation. Instead, the signaling was, we already have a competitive budget, and as a result of how competitive our budget is, there's no room for negotiation. Like that was boom, immediately out of the gate. And so the conversation at the site level shouldn't be, let me just take it and okay, because I'm being told there's no room for negotiation. The dialogue should shift and say, well, then there's no room for creativity. There's no room for us to adapt. There's no room because you're prescribing a fit for of protocol, we don't know how the protocol is going to actually, yes, it's one protocol, it's the same protocol across all sites, but the way in which every site will deliver on the needs of that study or on the needs of that protocol are quite different. The population needs of the patients that that site will reach are quite different, right? And so there's a signaling component to that, that it was like, yay, they did it, you know, if and then language, but then they're saying no negotiation. Okay.
Whatever they
We,
decide.
yeah,
It's interesting that you actually mentioned stress, because that's one of the questions from the audience. It's related to stress, especially at the sites, and it's related to stress in decentralized clinical trials. So let me just read the question from the audience. Using the centralized trial technologies, can this disempower sites in their care and relationship with patients? How do we counter this effectively? Any thoughts, Daniel, maybe? Do you
yeah.
think centralized clinical trials actually can disempower, like the technologies can disempower the connection with patients and sites?
It
What's your
can, it can if you're not effectively training your staff. It
Mhm.
can disempower the relationship with the patients if you're not taking the time, energy, and effort to understand that technology can absolutely make the connection happen in terms of the actual trial being conducted. But if you're not then training your staff and understanding the gap you introduce in the person in the personal connection and how to then leverage the technologies to overcompensate for that, then absolutely you can disempower the relationship with patients. You can disempower that level of care. But I would argue that an effective integration of decentralized clinical trial modalities includes a very aggressive training with your team on the humanism and the humanity of having patients participating in a study. It's not just, you know, let me get you in into the study and make sure that I'm tailoring your experience. Yes, that's certainly part of it, but what are you doing to actually connect with people? What are you doing to read between the lines? What are you doing to increase the emotional intelligence and self-awareness in your team to be able to understand, A, how are they coming across? B, are they aware of that? Are they actually aware? You know, one of the things that we do at Macro is we do an activity about Johari's window, where you've got these four quadrants of self-awareness, and where in those quadrants do you fit? And the reason why that's so important is because you need to be aware of your blind spots and how you're coming across, because it'll be different if it's over the phone versus Zoom versus remote versus you in person. And you need to understand that not no two human beings will ever be the same.
Yeah.
And as much and I think that the center of gravity for us is the need to connect. That's a very fundamental human need that every single person on this planet wants to feel connection. And so if you make that the focal point of your decentralized trial approach, then in that regard, technology can amplify and enhance the connection. But if you don't have that component into your thinking, into your planning, into your training, the technology can be a complete wedge dividing the patient from the clinical trial site.
And part of
I
that's the compliance too, right? So like the compliance part of me, the EQ loving part of me couldn't have said it better myself, right? Everything Daniel just said and more. And then when you tack on that regular clinical care is hard to navigate. I mean,
Mhm.
oncology, centers regularly have patient navigator positions just to help a patient truly navigate all the different appointments and all the different testing and all the different pieces they're going to be a part of their care. We're starting to see in certain spaces like oncology, where research was always complicated, COVID just made it even more so, clinical trial navigator positions. I think as you move into the decentralized space, you need to have eyes on that as a role, because it's going to become critical to maintain. You need to be doing everything Daniel just said, but then also having almost a role that's dedicated to helping your patients navigate that decentralized trial in whatever hybrid fashion you're conducting it in, so that they have several points of contact for different types of questions. And that may also be someone who could some of these logistical setup pieces, right, in terms of feasibility and site activation for the decentralized trial. So it could be a really well-rounded style of position or role in the organization that helps to administer and oversee. But I do think that it's necessary, because it's kind of like the example we talked about in an earlier section, where someone's really intimidated by technology. This could get really disconnected really fast from patient to provider, despite
Yeah.
best intentions.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said about technology having potentially amplify relationships. I'd also go a step further and say we shouldn't even be spending that much time training people, because if the technology's built right, it should be really easy to use out the box with minimal instructions. It should be intuitive. It should fit the workflows.
Sure.
And it should be interoperable. And if you look at what's happening in the consumer world, you can go on the web, you can sign up for an app, you can connect it to your QuickBooks or to your Outlook or to this, and you can set up your APIs, and you're up and running, and it's really fast. And you never read the instruction manual. You did maybe some quick search help. That's how we should have our technology, and we're far away. Okay, including Korea. We're not there yet. We all have to get there as tech vendors, but we're probably stuck in the 1990s paradigm of technology.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Raymond, because we do a lot of design boot camp at Macro, where we just take a step back and we take the seat of a designer. Okay, let's look at this process and let's put ourselves in the shoes of every single person that is going to come and touch and experience Macro. That includes the sponsors and CROs that we I know sponsors been in a hot seat in this conversation, but we put them in and we say, what is important to them? What are the values that are driving the decisions? What are the factors that are influencing patients' ability to want to engage or disengage? There's cultural components to that. I don't remember where. I feel like I'm having a lot of conversations nowadays, but there was a conversation about having a decentralized investigator that was a nurse practitioner, and that actually drove complete disengagement because culturally the group of patients said, was I not important enough for the doctor? Was the doctor not too busy? Why did I get a nurse? And so complete shutdown. And you've got a very narrow window of 0.5 milliseconds in which people make this connection and there's no going back. There's nope, forget it. Turn the cameras off, cut the lights. I don't want to do this anymore because the signaling I got was I wasn't important for the physician. So there's a lot of layers to it. Actually, I was reading an article about what the Native American nation here in the United States has done right with the vaccine rollout, and why is it that they're now vaccinating the pediatric population in that population? And the reason why is because they did a great job at connecting to Native Americans and saying that the vaccine will help ensure that our culture does not die. The vaccine will help ensure that our heritage live on. And so it unified with the values of Native Americans. It connected to what was important to them, and it got them, really gathering their own people and saying, we need to do this.
Well, the importance of tradition transcending age, as well as the great respect for elders that you have in the Native American culture, is those were the exact, not to make it sound manipulated, but pressure points that will resonate for that population. It was tailored, it was customized.
I love this example with the Native Americans. And I'm like, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking again what Daniel said about the study coordinators that are dollars to study coordinators. I was thinking, well, he mentioned that in Europe, actually, and most of the countries outside of the States, actually study coordinators is a rare thing, actually. It very much depends on, yes, actually, it's not like in the States, you almost always have a study coordinator. In a lot of the sites, because they're almost a lot of the sites actually in Europe, the ones that attract more research are like public hospitals. So they will have one nurse doing a lot of things. And believe me, study coordinator on top of that, you can't be a real study coordinator. And I feel like study coordinators are in the center of patient engagement, because how would you do that with like what you did with the Native Americans unless you know the universe of every single patient? In the end of the day.
And the other part of that is, to bring up the compliance caboose here, is as we think about that, and this is something that I couldn't be more fired up about, is you put that example that you just said, Maya, of this already taxed nurse in the middle of a pandemic, you add study coordinator responsibilities, you set them up as an organization, as a research team, as a PI for failure, okay? There is no way that they have been properly educated, trained, and frankly, resourced to truly conduct the research in a compliant fashion. It's not a rogue bad actor. It's someone who is in over their head because their organization put them in over their head, not usually because they were going, yeah, I want to do more, right? And then when the cookie crumbles, and it will, exactly whose shoulders does that fall on? The coordinator, that overtaxed nurse who was forced into it, who then says, screw this, I'm out. I don't want to do this research stuff. And we just lost someone who might have otherwise been connecting really well with patients, who, if properly trained and resourced, would have been a phenomenal clinical research nurse or research associate, or, you know, whatever. And how you can place, when you look at our regulatory infrastructure in FDA, in EMA, we very intentionally and clearly place onus and responsibility on the principal investigator. You don't see anywhere in those regulations where it says study coordinator or study nurse.
I hate
but
revision.
Right. And so I think it's one of those, operationally, we all know what happens. And then we all also know fiscally who gets paid the least in this scenario, the study coordinator, right? So we're going to assign in the regulations intentionally the responsibility of some of the most compliant functions at your site to the right person, to the sponsor, to the principal investigator, who are at a different compensation level and have different educational requirements, right? So it makes sense there. I'm fine with it being assigned there. And then operationally, we turn right around and delegate it to the person who already has the most on their plate, with the least compensation and the least resources and the least educational background, and they fail. And it's our fault, not theirs. And that is the highest turnover spot in all of your operations. If you want continuity of operations, you have to stop hemorrhaging turnover. And you're probably doing that most often at the coordinator and or nurse level. And that's right there why.
That's the
Sorry,
mic drop
well fired up
moment.
now.
For the leadership component.
One quick question, like before I summarize, do you think, because we discussed the coordinators, the business continuity and how this is related, we also discussed technology and disempowering, but also empowering the sites. I wonder, can, in your opinion, technology empower the study coordinators? Is that technology already available, or maybe we should think in that direction?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the good technology can make the coordinators more productive and should automate a lot of things that they're doing manually currently. Also, good technology will help with business continuity, because it's a lot easier to have continuity of operations when personnel shift, because all the data is captured, right? All the workflows are standardized, and it's a lot easier to plug a new person into that role because the technology will sort of guide you through the workflows. So the learning curve should be a little bit faster. So a lot easier if you have, good technology-based processes in place for that continuity of operations. You really want to move away from a model where you're reliant on the individual skill of a single coordinator, right? Where the quality of the trial rises or falls based on that person's particular attributes, right? You want to be able to deliver a consistent level of quality. And of course, you want to minimize turnover with your coordinators. But I think it's an and. I think if you have a good process that minimizes variation, that will also lead to more continuity of personnel, because it's also less stressful for the employees. So I think you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I love the discussion, but let me summarize, because I want to make sure that we all take something away from this conversation. Business continuity is definitely like harder with clinical trials, because I love what Raymond said. At the moment, we operate more like waterfalls compared to agile processes. And maybe we should think of like going after the agile approach rather than the waterfall. Regulatory is not an obstacle when it comes to business continuity. What is an obstacle is the fact that we have strict expectations and strict protocols and like operational SOPs and budget, most of all. So that, especially in times of pandemic, doesn't provide the flexibility that sites and like all these people that are directly facing the patients can actually use in order to ensure this business continuity. What we've all agreed, though, is that technology can empower that. Obviously, there are best practices around how do you become more adaptive towards protocol, towards SOPs and training. It definitely requires more creativity. It definitely requires also being more open to the site's suggestions and their flexibility as well. But then technology can also empower that. And we assume that if we have this if and then type of strategy with a protocol and provide all of the options for patients, that will bring better patient engagement. But that shouldn't also cost more if we're better prepared up front, if we better work together with the sites, with the CROs to kind of project these scenarios up front, and also to if the vendors are more like open to unit-based pricing, so
Mhm.
that it's all fair for everyone. That was a long summary, but very valuable discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.